Chapter 1 Prologue. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Truth counts for nothing in the face of destiny, Corco thought as his shivering hands dropped the flakes of poison into the cup, creating a ripple in the wine. His preparations completed, he picked up the cup and moved it to his lips. Halfway there, he stopped again, as he realized his folly. He couldn't possibly know how effective the dried palegrass would be. Maybe its essence would need time to spread throughout the wine first, maybe his haste would only cause him hours of suffering, rather than the quick release he was seeking. After all, he had no prior experience when it came to suicide. If it was up to him, he would rather not have to resort to the knife. Thus, Corco put the cup back down and got up from the shabby bed he could call his for the night. Even though he didn't feel stiff, Corco stretched out his back with a long sigh. Perhaps he had been aching from the slog which had been his life. With another look over to the nightstand, he once again saw the last cup of wine he would ever drink sit on the wobbly table by the bed. A table and a bed, that was all he had been given in the small hotel room he lived in for the night. On top of the table, he found a candle next to the wine, to scare the night away, and, behind them, the letter he had left behind. He fought the tremble in his fingers as he picked up the paper and began to check his final message to his friends once again, just to make sure. To whoever finds this, I am sorry, for I have taken the easy way out. BVEC, I was born with more than most, yet the world chose to take everything from me. My mother taken by the northern lords of Medalla. My land taken by my brothers. My future taken by the gods of Arcavia. My last home taken by the Duke of Balat. I tried to provide for those under my wing, but failed. Against the course of my life, the world has formed a stream of injustice and I do not have the means to fight it any longer. If any of you make it back home, tell Father that I understand. That sometimes, best intentions are not enough and that sometimes, there is no choice in life. I believe that I have been cursed. So long as you stay in my company, nothing good will come to you. Only ruin will follow. Which is why I will leave you here. Thank you for staying to the end. I did not deserve friends as true as you. In deep deference, with gratitude, Corcopeka Tita Primo Pluritac, heir to the silver crown and lord of the Argolakis. Corco put the letter back down and thought back to his last few tumultuous years. His father had sent him here, to this strange continent, to be the connection between his own Medalla Empire and the kingdoms of the foreigners, thus making himself indispensable to the empire's officials. Things didn't go as planned. Once he had arrived here, no one would acknowledge his identity. At that point the crown prince of Medalla was certain. He had been sent into exile by his own family. However, after 2 years of work, he had replaced his old family with a new one. Still, even this joy wouldn't last. After his master's death, his new home had been taken just like his old one, by those with more power than himself. It had been 2 years since his arrival on these shores. Just 2 years to have everything taken from him. He felt responsible to the ones who had remained by his side. Even more so, he felt responsible to his master's heir. Yet more than ever, he felt his impotence in front of the powerful, his own inability to master his fate. At this point, they were only left with a few coins and a few bottles of the old Fastgrade's favorite wine. Right, the wine. Corco picked the poisoned cup back up again. This time there were no more excuses. This time he was sure the wine would do its work. Well then, good night, he muttered as he brought the goblet to his lips. Corco wondered if he would see his past again once he drank the deadly liquid. He had heard the stories. Life's reflection. Some said that just before death, they would see their whole life flash before their eyes. As he looked out of the open window into the dark night, he just hoped it wouldn't last too long. Suddenly, the window changed its form. While it squashed down into smaller and smaller size, the black turned to white as the opening became brighter and brighter, until it had almost completely turned white. Fascinated, he stared into the strange window, to read the letters which were displayed there. Wait, window. This was his PC. Monitor, of course. Underscore 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 underscore. As if pulled by strings, he looked around and took inventory of what had been his life for the past few years. The chaotic mess of an apartment all around him, the empty bottles and pizza boxes as well as the worn clothes spoke of his desolation. Over time, the flickering window in his front had become his only friend. Thus, he stared back at the chat log, in a vain search for comfort. "You on, dude? Yeah, still here. So what you doin'?" You know how in the time travel-y, tech versus Magic Kingdom building stories the MC always knows way too much about chemistry and shit. "Yeah, I'm more in top scientia, so I've been compiling a list of various technologies, policies etc. you could use to turn an old society into a modern one and kinda going through wiki and shit for each one. LOL, think about it. Back before the Enlightenment, the world was divided up neatly. The highborn got everything and the lowborn got nothing. The entire system was built for their benefit. Then we had a bunch of neat revolutions over freedom and such, but did anything really change? Who led those uprisings? Who paid for them? In the 18th century or so, the wealthy divided up the world again. And this time, they built a system for their benefit instead. Just imagine. What kind of paradise could be created if we could go back, with everything we know today, and do things right this time? You got way too much time, Dwight. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here on a weekday at 3 a.m. Nice that you are here. Make me feel good about myself, lol. So I read an article recently about receding social mobility. I know that the whole communist thing was kinda bullshit, but maybe Marx was on to something about the distribution of wealth stuff. At least he is no more of a sci-fi novelist bullshitter than Friedman. LOL, what you talking about? Gotta go. Bye. Exhausted from the one-sided discussion, he turned to look back into his room. At this point, the mess didn't matter anymore. This place, together with everything else, would soon be taken anyways. All of his possessions, stolen by his own family, just because his uncle knew a few important people he didn't. There wasn't much he could do, but he wouldn't bow down to those in power. To reach his goals, he would simply have to give up more than most. He could never change the world at large, but at least this one time, he would beat the system. He looked over at the papers from the bank, at the massive loan he had taken out, before his gaze turned down to the bottle of pills in his hand. One after every meal, huh? I guess taking them before isn't so bad if I take 30 all at once. Hope you like my will, uncle. The company and the debt, or neither. Your move, asshole. He held the pills in one hand and a bottle of brandy in the other. Right after he had thrown the pills into his opened mouth, he put the brandy to his lips. Gotta wash it down with something. Well then, good night. Underscore 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 underscore. At last, Corco awoke from the memories which had not been his. The prince didn't know how long he had sat there, but his lips were still stuck on the deadly cup. Fuck. With a curse, he threw the object of his terror into the corner of the room. Pale grass. What had he almost swallowed just now? Spread the essence throughout the wine. What the fuck did that even mean? As he tried to organize the mess in his head, two lives turned into one. Without focus he looked down into the puddle of poison wine that slowly spread along the wooden floorboards. Long after the wine had dried and the sun had come up, he stood back up from his bed. At last, he was no longer lost. At last, he had the tools to change destiny itself. Chapter 2 Dilemma. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What's keeping Lockies so long? We have to move, and right quick. After an annoyed glance up the worn downstairs of the shabby inn, Atau stared back into his drink. From within the reflection in the stale, murky beer, a large man with bronze skin, a short beard and a long ponytail stared right back. His view got trapped there, as he contemplated whether or not to take another sip of the swill or live with a dry throat for the rest of the day. He had addressed to the man on his side, a mass of pure muscle, whose square features made Atau think he had been born straight from a stone. Fidelio di Pluritac, first son and heir to the great general of Medalla. As if to reinforce the impact the imposing title had by itself, his figure was so hulking that any who first saw him would assume he was beyond human, an impression made worse by the wild, jet-black hair which hung loose down his back. The man-mountain towered over Atau by almost a full head, the difference in height made worse by the fact that he had to stand, since he wouldn't trust the rickety chairs of the cheap inn they had found a temporary shelter in. Not after one had buckled under his weight last night. At least Fidelio's size had prevented the owner from demanding compensation for his loss. "Boss will be fine," the mountain replied in a smooth, somber voice, "I'm more concerned with our persistent tail." "How do they look, little one?" The hulking man looked down to the last of the trio which had taken place around their table, a young boy around the age of 12, almost on the cusp of manhood, though his childish features had yet to transform. He didn't share the bronze skin of his companions, or their long, dark hair. Instead, his complexion was as light as that of the men in their surroundings and his head framed by a light and lively brown. "They're still there, still too. Right by the entrance." The boy's alert, green eyes found the gap between his two companions and no doubt landed on the two armed soldiers who had followed them inside last night. "They're getting more and more brazen, aren't they?" The standing warrior answered as his frown deepened. Atau was sure the general's son would once again launch into complaints about their lack of courage in dealing with the pursuers, when Atau finally found the one they had been waiting for climbed down the stairs. "He's here." Rather than answer Fidelio's question, Atau's words moved everyone's attention to their leader and Atau's cousin, Crown Prince Corcopeka Tita Pluritac. The same long black hair which decorated their own heads flowed behind the prince, playing in the spring wind which entered from a window by their side. However, together with the dark skin tone, the hair was the only thing they had in common. A chubby face, with open and friendly eyes, marked a face far too ordinary for the prince of a mighty empire. His height would have counted as large among commoners, but for a nobleman of Medalla, he was far too short, with a stick-like physique, a remnant of the vile assassination he had survived in his youth. The boy and two men all looked towards the prince's thin figure in expectation. Even in their darkest hours, Corco had always done his best to stand up for them and lead them ahead. Since the old fast grade had died, he had once and for all become their leader, the one to inspire them. This time, they were in dire need of inspiration. Prince Corco, unaware of their thoughts, came over and plopped himself into his last unused chair, before he slammed an opened bottle of wine onto the table. Atau remembered the label on the front. It was fast grade's noblest. A fine grape from the hills of Calkia, one of the few things they had saved from the old fast grade merchant company. With a bitter look, Atau stared back down onto his tasteless beer. He couldn't help but compare it to his cousin's own drink. He didn't even have time to complain before Corco had already pushed the bottle next to his mug. "Here, no need to force that beer down. You can have this one." With an ease of heart, Atau took the offer and poured the beer out of the window to his side before he began to fill his mug with the expensive wine. It was a liberating feeling. "At least for today, we won't have to bother with that swill the people in this place call drink," Atau said. "You know," Corco replied, in a snide tone much unlike himself, "it's really not the beer's fault. That small beer, with an alcohol content of below 2.8%. Back in the Middle Ages, they drank this stuff rather than water, 'cause all the rivers around the cities were contaminated." Middle Ages. Atau looked up from his fresh pour and gave Corco a strange look. He didn't understand what his cousin had just said, but from the prince's own deep frown, Corco himself didn't seem to be all that sure. The uncomfortable silence started to weigh down on them, until Korko decided to ignore his strange behavior to ask the more pressing questions. So where do we stand with the Duke's men? Since Atau had returned his attention to his mug and was busy washing away the astringent taste of the cheap beer, Fidelio took it upon himself to answer the question. 2 over by the entrance. The rest of the Duke's men should be waiting somewhere outside. Shouldn't they have given up by now? I thought Etra was a free city. Why would they let the armed guards of a Bornish duke into their walls? Korko returned a light sigh before he glanced over to the men by the door. Atau followed the look over his shoulder, and immediately he noticed swords at the sides of the soldiers, at least as sharp as their stares. Swords meant that they were not mere militia. They were trained warriors, or even knights. Etra is a place right next to the Balat dukedom. Even if they're technically not part of the kingdom of Borna, they won't start a war with Duke Herak over some vagrants. Oh, I just had a brilliant plan, the towering Fidelio said, how about we just smash their heads in and be done with it? This is humiliating. How could solemn warriors of Medalla run from some lowly soldiers? Korko gave the warrior in his front a stern look. Meanwhile, Atau still enjoyed his wine. Fruity and refreshing, just the right flavor to start into a late spring day. As always, his cousin had a fable for picking wines. They're not alone. And they're not lowly either, Korko replied to his warrior attendant, those guys are wearing some pretty heavy chain mail. Looks like they don't even mind the weight. And they carry swords. They're most likely knights in disguise. You really think we can just take them, without armor and only a couple axes? Fidelio set out to refute, but Korko still wasn't finished. Not to mention, there's another 8 of them waiting outside. We're only 3 men, and I can barely call myself a warrior. I can take care of one. Maybe. How many do you want to deal with? 5. 6. This time, Fidelio didn't reply, but his frown still wouldn't leave his face. The general's son wasn't happy, being so exposed to the whims of others. Atau handed his mug of wine over to the hulking warrior. Less frowning, more drinking, he said with a grin. Fidelio tarried for a moment, before he took the presented mug and, in a single movement, put it on his lips. Even though he was only a warrior servant to Korko, Fidelio, first son of the great general of Medalla, had always been the most prideful among them. It made his continued loyalty in the face of their humiliation even more worthy of respect. Atau hoped the wine would take the man's mind off his attempt at a solution, which would have been as honorable as suicidal. So, a direct attack is out of the question, but what do we do then? Upon Atau's question, Korko leaned his hand onto his chin and began to tap his upper lip, like he sometimes did when he sank into thought. A few of his cousin's words had been strange this morning, but little moments like this one made Atau relieved that Korko was still the same. Brym, you've been to Master's hidden stash before, right? While Korko still stared onto the table in contemplation, he asked the boy next to him. Ah, yes big brother, but only the once. Father brought me over a few months back, just in case. The boy answered with a faltering voice. Fastgrade's death hadn't been easy on any of them, but of course the boy had been hit hardest. Good. How does the place look? Can you see inside? Can it be set on fire or smoked out? Brym looked at his big brother with dull eyes for a few seconds before he shook his head. No, it's well hidden in a cave in the hills. The cave leads down, so no smoke can enter from the outside either. A last tap on his lip and Korko's hand once again left his chin and landed flat on the table with a dull thump. Good. Perfect, actually. How much money do we have left? That without any further questions, everyone reached into their wallets, secret pockets and boots to assemble what little they had left. Soon, the table was sprinkled with an assortment of bronze and silver coins. Only 3 golden flecks were mixed in with the mound. For the top brass of the famous Fastgrade Merchant Company, it was an embarrassment. Atau felt a sting in his chest as he looked at the remaining coins on the table, far less than what they had started with. "What about yours?" he asked towards Corco. "Gone. Here, I bought this." He retrieved a vial from the deep pocket on his left and put it on the table, right in front of Fidelio. "It's pale grass. A poison." Corco's three companions stared at him with large eyes. "Boss, why did you?" Fidelio's words trailed off. None of them wanted to hear the answer to his question. "No worries, I'm fine. Just take the stuff away from me." Fidelio picked up the vial with an angry move. "I'll just throw it out," he said. "No, don't." Corco replied with a shake of his head, "You have no idea how expensive that stuff is. Plus, it might come in handy some time down the line. Just hold on to it." In a silent duel, the master and servant stared at each other, before Fidelio nodded with a grave face and made the vial disappear within one of his pockets. "In any case, the money we have here should be more than enough," Corco said with a lightness which had been oh so absent since the old fast grade had died. "You have a plan." Atao could feel the tightness in his chest ease up as well. There was still hope. At least the start of one. First step. "Let's make some brandy." Again, the three stared at their leader, in hope of a better explanation. "For now, we'll have to assemble a few things in the city. Let's get going." Corco piled up the coins on the table before he swept them into a bag held ready by Brym. Atao saw some shady characters in the dark corners of the inn and, not least, the rotund man behind the counter penetrate the burlap cloth with greedy stares. Atao only had to hint a grasp to his trusty axe before the eager criminals shied away, back into the darkness. No matter how down on their luck they were, they still looked anything but helpless. Once Corco had collected everyone's coin, he bound the ends of the sack and fastened it on his hip with rope, in a complex knot Atao had never seen. Soon, the fast-grade merchant company got up and walked past the Duke's men, out into the dirty roads of Etra. Atao could hear their tails rise behind them, no more than 10 steps behind. More and more brazen indeed. He just hoped his cousin's plan was a good one. Chapter 3 Alchemist Bombasticus. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The honored, free city of Etra was a stinking mess. Now that they were out in the open and saw the streets in the morning light, the thought returned to Corco once again. The warming sunshine did nothing to brighten up the alleys sprayed in gray and brown, which gave an accurate representation of the unspeakable smells around them. With every step he took, Corco's boots got sucked into the deep mixture of mud and stars knew what else which covered the main roads. No surprise, as Etra wasn't any worse than all the other so-called cities Corco had seen on the Arcavis continent. Their dirt roads, narrow and flanked by stone houses, couldn't hold a candle to the wide, plastered streets of Arguna. Not to mention that in terms of size, this place was only barely the size of some towns within the Medalla Empire, let alone the major cities. As always when the Crown Prince of Medalla walked around the smelly towns of Arcavia, he could feel the hostile stares of the hemp-clothed commoners around him, wary of the otherness he and his men represented. If it had been before, Corco would have shown nothing but disdain for them, simple minds incapable of understanding just who stood before them. After all, he, the Crown Prince of the powerful Medalla Empire, wouldn't sink so low as to compare himself to those heretic Arcavians, people who would throw their own filth out onto the street without shame. Even at his lowest point, forced to become a merchant's apprentice, his pride had still been intact. In many ways, it had limited their options and made the last 2 years far more arduous. After last night, he could now understand what the people around him saw, as if he was looking in from the outside. Their group was much too unusual. The 3 foreign warriors, with long hair and strange, dark skin, 2 of them massive in size, plus a young Borna boy. To further contrast their foreign nature, they would wear expensive, multi-layered shirts, like well-to-do men of Arcavia. It would have been surprising if they didn't attract suspicion. It would complicate their every move. Yesterday, Korko might have still been belligerent about this, but by now, his perspective had changed. He still wasn't sure just what had happened to him right as he tried to drink that deadly cup of wine. For now, however, he would just accept the gifts he had been given, and use the wisdom to the best of his abilities. He could still consider his future or his sanity once they had time to calm down. "The hyenas are still on our heels," Atau said from his left. Unlike Korko, the large warrior didn't care about any of the stares around himself. He had inherited his father's swagger, though not his candor. "Let them," Korko answered without looking back. Over the past 3 days, since Duke Harak had seized the entire estate of Garrett Fastgrade, the Duke's men had followed them step by step, ever closer. It was obvious that after he had taken the old Fastgrade's company, the Duke was determined to swallow every last bite. "It's better if we see them. At least this way we know exactly where they are." For Korko, there was nothing new to see even if he looked. Instead, he peeked down a side street to orient himself. They would need to do some shopping, but he had to find the market first. "This is the greatest shame House Pluritak has ever suffered," his personal attendant, and good friend, Fidelio insisted again in a voice steeped in wrath. "If only we still had our warriors we would crush them like bugs. I tell you, if I ever see that shameless snake Quirinu again I'll bury him in salt until it burns right through his eyes." "Forget about it," Korko replied with the same indifference as before, to suppress the warrior's sweltering rage. Last night had opened up his eyes to many things. At the moment, he found it hard to care much about himself, or about his pride. Quirinu and the other warriors only did what they had to for survival. "I can't even provide for you guys, let alone another 50 men. Plus, working for a mere merchant is a shame much greater than what most Medalla warriors would be willing to bear. That's still so weird. Here, merchants are men of status. Just look at how father was greeted every time he came to visit the Duke. Why would your people hate the traders so much?" The short and stubby Brym hopped through the mud, as he tried his best to keep up with the others. "Well, someone at some point in the distant past was dumb enough to think the merchants didn't produce anything, so they were considered worthless, making money off of the hard work of others." Korko's sentence trailed off at the end, as he spotted something within the dirt of the road. To the confusion of his companions, the crown prince bowed down and retrieved a fist-sized piece of stone from the mud, something he would have considered less than mundane a mere day ago. Without worry of the views of others, he used the money-laden burlap sack to clean the stone and reveal the simple blue and white pattern on the outside. "Anyone know what that is?" Korko asked his companions as he looked at them in expectation. "I know," Brym said in response, "I've seen this one before, when I last came here with father." "It's just a simple stone though, isn't it? It should be very common around this area." "It's more than just a stone." To the curious views of those around him, Korko drew his dagger and scratched at the surface of the rock. The cut left a deep, white mark, clearly visible on its surface. "No wonder there's only mud left in the road. If they built their main road from these things it would just fall apart after a season or two." Korko answered his cousin's remark with a nod. The discovery of soapstone would change his plans. He had a new goal before reaching the market, and this time he even knew the way. A quick look down a familiar alley and Korko marched ahead once again, his steps much more assured than before. "It's soapstone. I wasn't planning on this, but it's better to be safe than sorry, so let's go for a 2.4.1 deal. Having several ways out never hurts. Can we maybe, finally, find out what that grand plan of yours is?" his cousin asked in an annoyed tone as he looked around the grimy alley, darkened from the low, overhanging roofs on both sides. "Sure. First we have to crush up the stone, and for that, we'll need tools. Oh look, we're here." Korko moved up to a low-standing house hidden in a corner. Only few travelers would come here on accident, but Korko knew the way. He had been in these alleys, not even 1 day ago, and acquired the deadly poison which was meant to end his life. Now, the knowledge of these roads proved exceedingly useful. Luckily for him, the prince had always had an excellent memory and so he had found this place right away. Compared to its surroundings, the low stone building in their front looked neat and tidy, with the stinging smoke coming from its back to prove that the inhabitants were home. The murmur of water told Corco of a profession in need of waste disposal, and true enough, the symbol of quintessence carved into the wooden front door identified the owner as an alchemist. Though alchemy itself was considered a noble profession within Borna, the irritating fumes produced by the primitive chemists relegated them to the edges of civilization, together with dye makers, leather tanners and other unhealthy occupations. Corco banged on the door a few times and waited patiently, before a lanky middle-aged man opened up with a frown. A strange smell had not only infiltrated his waist-long beard and typically Bornish shoulder-length hair, but even his sturdy leather clothing. It seemed like he had been in the middle of some experiments. "Yes, what do you wish?" The alchemist stared at Corco with narrowed eyes, which twitched over to his warriors every now and then. "I want to buy something." Corco tried to answer with the most harmless smile he could muster. "The soldiers stay outside." The alchemist motioned his head towards Fidelio and Ital. Corco agreed and soon found himself within a small room crammed with little cabinets. No doubt they contained all kinds of mixtures and materials of dubious worth, though the discolored, gray wood and dust-free surface spoke of their heavy use. Still, Corco knew of the skills of the alchemists well enough. Compared to the things he had learned yesterday night, the man's knowledge would be of limited help. Even if he had been one of the few capable alchemists in the world who knew how to prepare rare mixtures like aqua regia, there was no way Corco could afford his services. Once the dangerous-looking warriors had been locked outside, the alchemist turned to greet Corco again, with open arms and a frank smile, as if his prior suspicion had never existed. "Hello and welcome, good sire. This is the workshop of the great Hieronymus Bombasticus. What is it you desire, which wish shall be served? A tonic to cure baldness? Or an ointment to find love? Maybe a cure for a deadly plague?" The great alchemist Hieronymus Bombasticus has learned from all the famous masters and guarantees success. The theatrical movements and ridiculous boasts of the strange man gave Corco an idea of why an alchemist would waste his time in a free city, when there was much more money to be made at the court of a noble. More likely than not, the great alchemist had oversold his skills and been forced into hiding. Still, for Corco's purposes, the man was perfect. He didn't need much from him, after all. "I want to buy a mortar and pestle." Bombasticus still held his inviting smile on his face, but by the time he finally answered, it had turned a bit stiff. "Excuse me, could you repeat that, good sire?" "I want to buy a mortar and pestle from this place. Sturdy, made of stone." "You have one, right?" "Excuse me sire, but does this place here look like an artisan's shop? Did sire maybe fail to see the quintessence carved on the door?" "No, I saw it. That's why I'm here. I figure that an alchemist would have a mortar and pestle ready and handy. You see, I'm in a bit of a hurry, and I can't really wait until I get one handmade from some stone cutter. It may be unfortunate for you, sire, but as you could expect, I myself am very much in need of my mortar. There is little chance I would." While the alchemist was talking down on Corco with his nose raised up towards his soot-covered ceiling, the prince dug deep into his jingling wallet and pulled out one of his remaining 3 gold coins. The warm glimmer danced in front of Hieronymus' face. It was more than enough to shut the alchemist up. "I'll pay you well. You really don't want to trade?" Hieronymus licked his lips before he grabbed the coin, his hand like the maws of a crocodile pulling its prey into the waters. Immediately, the man went over to a cabinet in the corner and used the scale on top to measure the coin's worth. Corco knew his currency was genuine, so he just stood aside and let the alchemist work. A few seconds of hectic activity and Hieronymus looked back up. Greedy stares shot into the wallet the first coin had appeared from. From the outside, it seemed to be quite full. It is unfortunate, but the coin is of shoddy quality. Sire will have to pay at least 2. No, 3 coins of this sort if you wish to buy the exclusive, mystical mortar of the famous Hieronymus Bombasticus. Okay, that's not gonna happen. One eyebrow raised and his shoulders tensed in annoyance, the prince stomped forward and opened the wallet for the alchemist to see inside. Look, there's almost nothing in there. Mostly silver and bronze. That's what, another 3 or 4 gold altogether. If you want to scam someone, look for a richer target. So if you won't take my offer, I'll go somewhere else. There's other people with mortars in the city, you know. The alchemist got back up from his crouched position to face the prince in earnest. Good, I understand. 1 coin it is then. The light in the alchemist's eyes was gone. Of course Corco wasn't so naive to just trust that he wouldn't try anything later, or tip off some local gang for a cut. Luckily, the Duke of Ballet had sent an excellent group of guardsmen to protect Prince Corco and his men. He wouldn't have to fear getting robbed, not until they had reached the hidden cache of the old fast grade. Here, sire. Anything else the great Hieronymus Bombasticus can be of service with. Bombasticus handed his customer the stone mortar and pestle, the tools Corco would need to crush the soapstone. Which just left one piece of his plan left undone. You don't also carry lye, do you? Lye, the alchemist replied with disgust scrunched into his face, that unsavory substance is for tanners and dyers. No, a grand alchemist like myself only deals in the most precious and arcane of materials. Right. You don't know where the tanners or dyers are in this city then? Shouldn't they be around here somewhere, downstream along the river? Oh no, the tanners and dyers are guilds not represented within Etra. You see, good sire, the king of Borna would not want the commoners making armor, so no tanneries are allowed within any of the free cities. And the dyers make too much money to leave to the common folk, Corco added. Got it. In that case, I'll just have to make some myself. Looks like our shopping list just got a little longer. Anything for a good customer. If sire ever needs any more mortars, sire will know where to find me. The alchemist saw off Corco with sincere words, but his hand still clutched the gold coin like a vice and spoke a different language. Actually. Already half out of the door, Corco turned around one final time. If the alchemist was this desperate for money, he might be able to help out with one more step of his plan. Do you have a way to distill liquids here? Bombasticus looked confused for the fraction of a second, before his chest swelled and he returned to his bragging ways. Of course. The still is the heart of any proper alchemist's workshop. The world-renowned Hieronymus Bombasticus owns the greatest still in all of Etra. Corco's smile turned into a grin. This visit had been more than worth it. So how much would I have to pay you if I wanted to use your still for a few days? His chest still raised towards the low ceiling of the shop, Hieronymus added a light sneer to his self-important expression. A true alchemist would never give away his tools like that. It would take much more than the anemic contents of that wallet to change my mind. Perfect. With a wide grin, Corco took the tools he had just bought and left the building without another word. If everything went according to plan, he would soon have enough money to let the alchemist do whatever he wanted. First though, he would have to reach the cache and take care of the Duke's men. Chapter 4 First Experiment. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Various pots and pans, cheesecloths, stones, oil, mortar and pestle, ropes, firewood. Corco's eyes gazed over the collection of their new acquisitions. Finally, they landed on the lone donkey cart which had carried all of it here. It was too strange. How had there not been any horses in Etra? In fact, he had never even seen a horse, not once in his life. Even so, he was keenly aware of their existence, and their importance for human advancement. So where were they? Corco shook his head and the confusing thoughts with it. For now, there was still more work to be done. He grabbed the mortar and pestle and looked towards the bonfire they had erected on top of a small hill. By now they were most of the way to their goal, but they wouldn't move in on the cache until they had prepared. Thus, they had set up camp early and begun burning a fire throughout the evening. He walked over to the man who had been feeding the flames with the cheap, green firewood, silhouetted against the orange glow. "How's it going?" Corco asked Fidelio's shadow. The giant warrior stopped shoveling the branches into the flames and looked to the left instead, towards a second bonfire 1 hill over. "The flies are still there. Maybe we could take them in a night raid. If you could just give me 2 more men, this would be no problem. But we don't have more men. Still, it's not like there's no hope." Corco tried to sound optimistic before he pressed the mortar into the warrior's chest. On reflex, Fidelio dropped the branches and held on to the stone bowl, confusion written across his face. "We're done with the fire," Corco explained, "all we need is the ashes anyways, so we should have more than enough already. I'll start making the lye once cousin is back. In the meantime, you can go ahead and prepare our backup plan." "Which is?" The erratic flames played frightening shadows on the man's face, but Corco was unimpressed. He knew of his loyalty, and his honest nature. "Stone grinding. You take that soapstone over there and grind it to bits." The mountain nodded weakly, before he returned to his senses and tensed up. "Wait, all of it? By myself?" "Of course." Corco looked back over to the mountain of pebbles they had collected on their way here. "Are you expecting me to do that? Just look at the volume. My arms are gonna fall off. Be careful though and wear some cloth over your face. I'm serious. The powder you'll make from grinding is a potent weapon. At least potent enough." Finally some clarity from the great oracle. Atau complained from behind. Under heavy breathing, he labored the last few steps up the hill before he dropped the 2 water-laden pots with a groan. "So what do we do with all that water, oh wise one?" "No need to insult Prince Corco just because you have no strength," Fidelio chimed in. "You wanna see what my strength can do, mountain gorilla?" "Stop." Corco's shout put an end to their bickering before they could get going. "If you're itching for a fight, you can look ahead to tomorrow. We'll have to fight harder than even you would want. You wanna get injured, right before our life is on the line." This servant apologizes. "I wasn't really trying to fight or anything." Even though they spoke over each other, it was obvious which words had come from which man. "Right. Let's focus, shall we? Brym, how's the second fire looking?" "Burning well." To answer Corco's shout, Brym's voice came from the other side of the flames, where the boy had been making a smaller, cleaner and more controlled fire with the better firewood they had bought. This one wouldn't be used for ashes. They needed it for evaporation. "Okay, let's get to work then," the prince said with a frown. He was still unsure if any of today's preparations would prove useful. He just hoped he wasn't crazy. As the large bonfire began to burn down, the 4 merchants had taken seat around the smaller flames. By now, a pot had been placed on top, filled with water. They were in the process of preparing a second batch. Brym held the empty pot and Corco fastened the cheesecloth over it. Meanwhile, Atau did his best not to spill any of the murky water onto their hands. "Isn't this just dirty water? What is throwing ash into perfectly good river water gonna do for us?" "You're not wrong. It's just water with ash. But ash contains potassium carbonate. At least the kind of ash we just made does. We put the ash in the water, which dissolves the potassium. Just like how salt would dissolve in water as well. Then strain it through the cloth and filter out everything else. You're left with only the solution. Evaporate the water and only lye is left. It's called leaching." Finally, Atau had finished his pour and put the emptied pot to the side. "That's all well and good, but what are we gonna do with that lye of yours?" "Lye is an excellent, or let's say terrible, skin irritant. He looked at his two companions who stared at him with a dull look, so Korko cleared his throat in embarrassment. He had to be mindful of using too many strange words. Lie makes for a pretty good weapon. Blow some into a warrior's face and he'll be out of the fight. Permanently if he's unlucky. It's gonna burn his eyes right out of his skull. That's the plan. Oh. Excuse this servant, but where would the stones come into play? This servant has no habit of complaint, however. Fidelio shouted from some ways away. Both his forearms were snow-white at this point, covered by the white powder he had been producing from the stone all this time. It's an insurance. A backup plan, in case I'm wrong about the lie. What you're making is talcum powder. The effects are similar enough, but it's much less potent. Korko lectured with a raised finger. Not to be rude, but how do you know all of this stuff anyways? Isn't that something only an alchemist should be privy to? Atao asked. That I'm not too sure myself. I'm really just gambling. Though if we want to have any kind of future, we'll have to gamble anyways. The prince replied with a look towards the fire on the other hill. Let's see if we've been wasting our time. Korko really wasn't too eager, but at this point, they had completed just about every other part of his plan. Everything apart from checking on the pot over the fire. Even though he dreaded to see the results, there was no more reason for delay. It was time to look into the pot and see if any of the wisdom in his head was actually real, or if he had imagined everything, a desperate hallucination of his mind, hell-bent on preventing his suicide. As he moved in on the pot, Korko's steps got shorter and shorter. Finally, he faked courage and made a last, large stride to peek into the container. There was still a final sliver of water bubbling in its bottom, but with narrowed eyes, through the flickering of the bonfire, Korko could see what he had been hoping for. A thin, white crust had formed on the sides of the pot. Carefully, with trembling hands, Korko picked up a twig and scraped off some of the material. He carefully brought it up to his nose and smelled the odor he had expected. Nothing. He took it over to the oils he had prepared in a bowl and began to swirl the stick around in the mixture, until the powder had disappeared. Under the curious eyes of his three friends, Korko took a small sample of the mix and rubbed it between his fingers. The soapy texture was all too familiar to him. His hopes were fulfilled. Lie. Korko's eyes shot open in realization. He jumped up, his shocked friends backing off to give the prince some room. The prince, in turn, began to shout and jump around in oblivious joy, his hands flailing in the late evening air, as he created dancing shadows all around the three paralyzed onlookers. Lockies, you alright? He heard from a worried Atao. Of course they would worry. His behavior had been erratic all day and this did nothing to alleviate their concerns. Still, he just couldn't help himself. Not with what this confirmation meant. The knowledge in his head, it was real. Some of it at least, maybe most of it. Even though the corners of Korko's mouth were still trending up, he tried to rein in his happiness. It was time to come clean about his experience and for that he needed to be calm. His friends had blindly followed for long enough. They deserved answers. Korko reorganized his messy clothes and came back over to his friends. Stop what you're doing. You too, Fidelio. Just drop the rock. Take a seat, everyone. There's something I have to tell you. Soon, the group had huddled around the fire. Brym, the only one of the four who wasn't a cultivator, moved closer to the flames and drew his shirt tight to his body in defense against the fresh spring wind. Korko looked over the fire, to the people he trusted more than anyone in the world, and began his explanation. Yesterday night, I almost did something stupid. Something irreversible. At least you understand. His cousin's annoyed voice rang from across the flames, something Korko chose to ignore. At the time, I couldn't find a way out. It felt like we were cursed. But, as I was about to take my life, only moments away, a miracle happened. And I saw something. What was it? It was BRYM's voice this time, full of curiosity. I'm not sure, to be honest. I saw many things. Things which don't exist in this world, or at least not yet. I saw the life of a man from a different time or a different space. Maybe I lived through that life before, through reincarnation. Or maybe a second spirit entered this body, and now the two of us are one and the same. Fuck, I have no clue. Frustrated, he looked down onto his hands, which were now clutching the letter he had written yesterday, the suicide note. He hadn't even realized when he had taken it out. But you are still. You. Carefully, the curious BRYM posed the question the two others were too polite or too afraid to ask. That I don't know. I'm different, at least. Even if no foreign soul has influenced mine, all the memories, all the knowledge I've received. It changed me, it had to. After all, we are nothing but memories plus predisposition. And that's it. The great reveal. You're expecting us to just believe that. What, did Pasha itself embrace you and impart the wisdom of the worlds? Atao's words were snide, but his voice lacked sharpness. Of course he wasn't ready to believe what Korko had said. If their roles had been reversed, he wouldn't have believed his cousin either. So what about all the stuff in my head? Atom bombs, internet, calculus, world wars. What about the lie, and the soapstone? You asked me how I knew about these things and this is the answer. Honestly, you don't have to believe me. It really doesn't matter where I got any of this stuff from. The only thing that matters is that I know. After last night, I know more than any other man in this world. And I have learned that knowledge is a weapon. It will be our weapon of choice, to return everything that has been taken from us. To return Master's company, to return the favor to the Duke, return the land that has been stolen from me. But I cannot do this alone. No matter how much I know, all wisdom will be useless until it becomes reality. For this, I need your help, again, like so many times before. In return, I can guarantee you the grandest, most emphatic lives any men have ever lived. We, just us four, will change the world. Forever. He looked around the fire, at the men and boy who had grown quiet at Korko's solemn speech. Slowly, the prince stood up, and without a word the others followed his example. Before the stars in the sky, I, Korkapeka Tita Pluritak, swear on the blood of my ancestors. To lead you, protect you, provide you. To guide you to the promised land, the future. An oath, almost the one a Medalla lord would take when he accepted new warriors into his household. Yet at the same time, it was so different. Not a promise of blood and honor, but a promise of protection, a promise of the blinding future only Korko could see. Fidelio di Pluritak accepts the oath, and swears eternal fealty, through the depths and into the sky. The warrior had gone through the oath before, just before they had been forced to leave Medalla for Arcavia, so he knew the words well. He repeated them with his usual sincerity. Atao di Pluritak accepts the oath and swears eternal fealty, through the depths and into the sky. Atao Sakartu, second son of the southern governor of Medalla, had made his choice as well. A smile formed on Korko's lips. The prince had known his cousin would follow along. He had always had his back, no matter how much he liked to complain. Brimstock di Pluritak swears fealty, through the depths and to the sky. Frank laughter followed BRYM's uncertain voice. Close enough, kid, Atao joked. Korko looked back down onto the crumpled note he was still holding in his hand, while BRYM's complaints about his cousin's teasing rang around him. He still didn't understand the true nature of last night's vision. Had his body been taken over by someone else? Was this an iceguy.ing? No, the man in his memories hadn't been killed by a truck. For now it wouldn't matter. He finally had found the way to fight back, to oppose the fate he had been cursed with, and to build a system, build a world beyond the one his other self had despised right until his death. Refreshed at the thought, Corco tossed the letter into the fire. He wouldn't need it any longer. Chapter 5 The Smell of Hope. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Fidelio looked over to his left, to the bearded southerner he would have to entrust his life to soon. Atau was armed with a stern look on his face and a heavy axe in his right. They had also fashioned improvised shields, a fancy term for wood planks, out of the donkey cart they had arrived on. Fidelio held on to his own, and increased his grip around the tightly bound leather strips. Then he looked out ahead, towards the golden light of morning which washed into the narrow cave. After they had spent the night on top of that hill, they had packed up before the break of dawn and made their way here, into Fastgrade's secret stash. Once Brym had led them into the hidden cave, concealed halfway up the steep hillside, they had been blinded by the treasures on offer. Barrels upon barrels of Fastgrade's finest, the best selection of wines in the southern states. Behind it, they found precious gems, jewelry and most of all, gold. An entire chest's worth of coins, hundreds of them, thousands even. They were the last reserves the old man had laid aside for a rainy day. Despite the sunshine in his front, it very much felt like a rainy day to Fidelio. Their tail might have been shaken for a while by their fast disappearance, but they would soon follow their steps. This was what the Duke had been after, the last treasure of the Fastgrade merchants. Finally, the flies deemed themselves ready to show their faces. First came the smoke. A dark cloud flowed inside the cave and obscured the ceiling. His master had been right. In fear of an ambush, they had truly tried to smoke them out of the hideout, but had failed. The smoke stopped some ways above his head, before it began to flow back out of the opening up top. At this point, the Duke's men only had two choices left. Either siege the cave and wait for the trapped merchants to starve, or get it over with and storm. Confident in their numbers and equipment, they had chosen the latter. On the name of Duke Herak of Balat, come out and hand over what is rightfully his. No harm will come to you. You have my word. A raspy voice came from within the sunlight. You want our stuff. I've got a nice bit of metal for you right here. How about you come and get it? He could feel Atau's sarcasm wash over from his left, but he wouldn't laugh, and he wouldn't look. He was ready to fight, focused on the silhouettes which had appeared from above, their backs lighted by the sunshine. In that case you will learn how the Duke's men handle rebels. Charge! The rough voice began to shout, answered by the war cries of his companions. Finally, the flies left the light as they stormed down the cave entrance. Finally, Fidelio could see them. Same as before. Swords and chain mail. No ranged weapons. Small, thin. Easy. The warrior turned his left foot forward, bent his knees and waited for the charge to hit his shield. The cave entrance was long and narrow, only enough for two men to fight next to one another, but they had to be careful. A few steps back and they would be pushed into the cave proper, where there was enough room for the Duke's men to make use of their numbers. As he thought about their plan, the screams in his front grew louder and louder, until a heavy impact exploded on the plank of wood and traveled up his shoulder. The cheap plank bent and splintered, but it didn't break. Good enough. With his heels dug into the sandy ground, the warrior halted the charge and pushed forward. Another shout rang from across the shield, this time tinged in surprise, not bloodlust. Despite Fidelio's size, the men hadn't expected this level of resistance. How could they know that 3 of the 4 remaining fast-grade merchants were cultivators of the highest grade? Brought off his balance, the soldier had to halt the sword thrust aimed at his enemy's flank and stumbled back, desperate to steady himself. Without mercy, Fidelio swung down his axe. The soldier's eyes grew large as he saw his impending doom draw close, yet he was in the air, falling back into the sand, and incapable of reply. The heavy crunch of metal on bone and the soft resistance in his palm told Fidelio that the axe head had landed with precision and caught itself on a rib cage. Even if the man was still alive, he wouldn't be a threat anymore. A scream rose from his left, to match the one in his front. Not a voice he was familiar with. Seemed like the southerner had done his duty too. The Duke's men had thought their work easy. After all, they had the higher ground and they could storm with speed, but in their arrogance they had dismissed their opponents, critically so. Back, back, the raspy voice screamed from the entrance. Two of the remaining soldiers slid forward on the uneven ground, towards the two bleeding companions who were crawling back. They confirmed that the merchants wouldn't pursue before they dragged their screaming companions back out into the sunlight. Fidelio clicked his tongue in annoyance. He wouldn't be able to finish them off for now. Holding formation was more important. 8 left, Fidelio said to his left before he spat on the ground. These weaklings were nothing. He could take down as many as he wanted. Don't forget the plan, Mountain Troll. The next wave won't be this easy. They're not that stupid. The voice from his left was as annoying as it was right. Fidelio had no time to answer though. Again, the Duke's men were coming. This time, they were more careful. They moved in slowly and stayed at a distance, poking at their shields. The improvised protection was barely enough to help them hold against a charge. Already, holes and sprains had opened up within the wood. Worst of all, the swords of their foes were much longer than his axe. Now the soldiers could take their time and try for gaps in their defense, until they landed a hit or destroyed the shields. A storm up the hill would be suicide, so it wasn't an option. Neither was a retreat into the cave. With how careful the men were now, they would never storm in all at once, which was what Corco had been betting on. Luckily, Garrett Fastgrade had stocked his secret cave well, for many eventualities. A sharp bang came from his right, followed by the stinging smell of gunpowder. With a scream, the soldier to his front stumbled back onto the ground. Corco retrieved the matchlock rifle from Fidelio's shoulder and retreated back into the cave, no doubt to reload. No need, Fidelio thought with a look at the Duke's men. Finally, they were angry enough to attempt a second charge. Again, 2 men stormed ahead, down the narrow entrance, and rammed against their shields. Again, he was pushed a few steps. This time however, he had no time to steady himself and hit back. Another impact followed soon after the first, to push him further, and then another. By the time the warrior had managed to halt his movements, he had been pushed most of the way into the cave. In anger, Fidelio swung his axe past his tattered shield. He only hit the air. The careful soldiers had stepped back fast to open up the distance again. Once again, they began their poking, like the annoying flies they were. Both Fidelio and Atau to his side were only a step away from opening up the path into the cave. Just one step and the soldiers could surround them. 3 down, still 7 left, they wouldn't stand a chance at 7-3. It turned out that the soldiers were well familiar with battle. Even losing 3 of their own hadn't dampened their morale. It had only made them more determined. Can't take them like this, unwilling, Fidelio followed Atau, who had already begun their planned retreat, and also took a step back to keep up. Drive them back. One more push, again, the raspy voice, maybe their leader, shouted from behind the soldiers. Fidelio's eyes glanced up at the cloth spanned over the entrance, as he waited for the signal. Retreat. He heard his master's shout from behind. A leap back and then another one. Suddenly, the 2 warriors had opened a gap between themselves and their foes. At the same time, he could see the construction they had erected above the entrance in full. Cheesecloths had been fastened there with rope and he saw Brym to the side, pulling the rope's end to release the contents. Just in time, the ropes loosened and unleashed a white cloud upon the charging soldiers. It was the last thing Fidelio saw before he turned around and closed his eyes. Cover up. He heard someone shout from his front. Corco maybe. Almost forgot, he grabbed the cloth around his neck and put it over his mouth and nose. No use in a weapon that hurts our own, he thought. Right after, the men behind him started to call out as well. However, their shouts were of a much different nature. He could hear the flies flailing and falling over one another, accentuated by a chaos of voices. First it was only shouts of anger and confusion, but soon they transformed into piercing wails of terror. Blind himself, he did his best to stumble forward, away from the deadly powder, into the back of the room. To his right he could still hear a Tao stagger along. Good, they had both made it out. It's fine, open your eyes. After what felt like an eternity, he could hear a voice of comfort in his front. Slowly, he opened his eyes and found his master Corco before him, gesturing back towards the entrance with his head. Fidelio turned as well, to survey the damage they had done. Behind him, within the settling cloud of white powder, the soldiers of the Duke were still screaming. Their desperate wails and curses filled the cave as they stumbled around, lost and blind, in search for salvation. We should finish this, Atao's voice, muffled by cloth, came from his right. He was already outfitted with their final piece of special equipment. Corco had cut the final bits of cheesecloth into strips. They would wear them over their eyes like blinds. After all, they would have to protect themselves from the monstrous weapon they had unleashed over their enemies. Fidelio grabbed the blind his master held towards him and soon had covered his eyes. The world turned dim, only silhouettes were left. Still, it would be enough for the kind of fight they were about to have. With short steps, to make sure he wouldn't trip on the uneven ground, Fidelio marched ahead, until he discovered one of the wailing shadows before him. All he had to do was bring down his axe. And another. And a third. Soon after, the shadows had become ghosts and the screams had stopped. There's still 3 outside, Fidelio said, as he fumbled his way forward, towards the blob of light within his vision. They had to be thorough. If they let just one of the men get away, it would mean that the Duke would hear word of their battle all the sooner. It would also mean less time for them to get away before they had to deal with an army. Once Fidelio could feel the rising ground beneath his feet, he knew that he had once again entered the cave's narrow entrance and, relieved to be rid of his bindings, removed the cloth from his eyes. With his eyesight regained, he looked back and saw the corpses. 7 of them, lying there with warped limbs, covered in white powder like freshly fallen snow, as their blood slowly formed paintings around them and bubbled up into a pink foam. A cold shiver ran down the warrior's spine, an emotion he was thoroughly unfamiliar with. From across their handiwork, his eyes met Atao's, and he saw the terror written within them. He had to agree. This wasn't a weapon they should use. At the very least, he knew that he wouldn't be crazy enough to have another fight anywhere near that stuff. However, there was still work to be done, so the warrior shook off his fears and marched away from his massacre, back out into the sunlight to commit another one. Once he emerged from the darkness, he held up his blood-stained hand and the what little remained of his shield to protect his eyes from the golden rays brushing over the distant hills. The grass around him swayed slowly in the morning breeze, which did its best to drive the smell of death from his body. Once his eyes had adjusted, he could see the remaining soldiers the Duke had sent to rob and kill them. 2 of them were leaned against the rocky outer walls of the cave, which were jutting out from the grassy knoll behind him. The soldiers groaned in pain as they each pressed onto their wounds. The final one lay on the ground, unconscious or dead, his left leg attached to his body by little more than a thread. As the 2 conscious men saw him look at them, their cries of pain stopped as they widened their eyes in panic. Fidelio marched 2 secure steps and lowered his axe again, onto the one he thought unconscious. Better to make sure, when his blood-stained face swerved back up to the remaining 2, their paralyzed bodies finally began to move again. In panic, they pushed off the rock wall and scrambled to get away. The first had been caught at the hip by Corco's shot, so his attempt was short-lived. As soon as he put some pressure on his body, he once again collapsed in pain, as his waist gave in and dropped him to the floor. Fidelio went over his enemy and swung again, without mercy. 1 left, he looked over to the running silhouette halfway down the hill, then down to the trail of red which had formed in the grass between him and his target. Again, the warrior marched towards the rising sun. The final man was the first he had met in the fight, the one who had opened the charge. Earlier, Fidelio's axe had caught the fly's chest with a solid hit. He wouldn't make it very far. No long after, the warrior was proven right. As he crossed over another hill's crest, the sun returned and once again it managed to blind him. Still, through the golden glow he could see the silhouette hunched over by the single tree which had claimed this elevation for itself. Fidelio took a heavy breath to steady his beating heart and strode towards the shadow, which slowly turned back into a human, terrified of his impending death. "No, please. Let me go." He heard the man beg and saw the tears and snot run down his face, his breathing ragged in his panic. He was out of options, so this was the best he could do to save his life. "I'll never do it again. Please. I will take my family and run far, far away. You'll never see me again." Finally, the warrior had followed the red trail to its end and stood over the fly. Wedged in between the old, deformed tree and the giant beast, the cold of their condensing shadows made the soldier shiver. His quivering voice had turned into a whisper. "Please. I'll be forever in your debt. Just on." Without mercy, the heavy steel swung down to end the man's begging, and his life with it. "Pathetic," the warrior said with a frown on his face, "you could have died like a man." With an unsavory crunch, Fidelio pulled out his weapon one final time for the day. Axe shouldered, he looked over the hills and towards the sun. The grass and earth around him were soaked with blood, shimmering like liquid gold in the rays of sunlight. The smell of iron was all around him. It smelled like hope. Chapter 6 Respective Plans. You are listening at novelfull.audio. By the time Fidelio had returned to the mouth of the cave, he saw Atau carry the last of the treasures out into the open. Before the warrior's eyes, a mountain of barrels and chests had been loaded onto what was left of their cart. At least the Duke's men had known enough decency to leave the donkey alive. It would make their next journey much easier, though he didn't know yet where it would lead them. "Where is Master?" Fidelio asked the bearded southerner as he came forward. "Corco's still inside, mixing some stuff together again. Here, help with that." Atau pointed down to the chest by his feet, the last treasure they had to load up before they were ready to depart. Together, the two men grabbed onto the box and, with heavy groans, carried it up onto the worn wood planks. Still out of breath, Atau nodded in gratitude. "So, now what?" he asked as he turned around and took a heavy seat next to the chest. "Now, we go back to Etra," Corco answered from behind. Fidelio turned and found both Corco and Brym standing by the cave entrance. The prince carried a bowl filled with a white substance in his left, but Fidelio never even registered his master's shield hand. He could only look towards his right, where the prince held his own ponytail, cut off from his head. "Master!" Fidelio muttered in shock. "By the depths, what are you doing?" the incredulous voice of Corco's cousin rang out. "I cut my hair. I also made a little something. Move over." Corco moved to his two friends, and, after Atau had made some room, took place on top of the wagon as well. But how could a prince of Medalla be allowed to lose his hair? Why wouldn't you stop him? Wide-eyed, Atau stared over to the flustered Brym. Wait, I didn't know the hair was special. If I knew I would have done something." Rattled by their reactions, Brym tried to defend himself as his eyes focused on Atau in hope for an explanation. "The long hair is the symbol of our pride. Only a defeated warrior will cut his hair, in shame. And we were defeated. Can you deny that?" Corco's calm voice answered for the confused Brym. "This was no defeat. Look around you." Fidelio refuted in anger. Rather than turn towards the corpses, Corco turned away, a queasy feeling rising in his stomach. At least they hadn't eaten breakfast today. Otherwise, he was sure he would have lost his meal at the horrific sight of the dead soldiers he and Brym had passed on their way through the cave. Even so, Atau had loaded up the entire cart in the time it had taken CPRCP to stop shaking. It seemed like the new memories didn't only come with advantages. We lost almost everything and we were driven out of the country. You think that's a win, the prince continued. With how easy these flies were to take down, why not go back and show that Duke what price there is to pay for messing with men of Medalla? Those were only 10 people. And it was far from easy. Do you have any idea how many men the Duke has? You want to battle your way through an entire army. We won't have to. With our courage and master's new ideas, we can circumvent the armies and take the Duke down all the same. And then what? What happens after, if your suicidal plan works out? We'll be the heathens who killed Duke Herak of Balat, brother to the Bornish king. We'll be wanted men all over the continent. Don't forget that our goals are greater than just taking down one duke who was mean to us. We want to rebuild the fast-grade merchants. You think we can still do that once we have noble blood on our hands? Corco gave his overzealous attendant a stern look. Fidelio was far too prideful for his own good. If they wanted to avoid unnecessary trouble in the future, the warrior would have to change as well. Then what, are we just gonna run? Atau asked the question the servant wouldn't. For now, we will have to disappear. Corco nodded his head as he rubbed his fingers into the mix of talcum and oil he had improvised. Then he began to rub the cream onto his face. You're whitening your skin, his cousin asked in consternation. No need for that kind of look. I know. I threw my powder away halfway across the sea, but things are different now. But you wouldn't even whiten your skin in Medalla. In Medalla the whitening is done for nothing more than the vanity of the lords. Back home, everyone's got more or less the same skin color anyways. Here, things are different. If we want to disappear, we need to be less visible first. Corco looked to his two giant companions with a frown. At least somewhat. So we leave Borna and rebuild the company. Easy enough, but what happens if another Duke Herak comes along? There's nothing we can do if a greedy noble tries to steal our things again, is there? Corco felt a smile creep onto his face. 2 days ago, this was the thought which had caused so much of his desperation. Back then, he didn't have an answer to the question, but now he did. That's easy. Imagine this. The great nobles of the Arcavian continent are all taken by the newest fad. There is a new, unique product to show off their wealth and sophistication with. And the only place they can buy it is from us. No lord would be dumb enough to steal from us then. If their greed means that our product won't be sold again, they draw the ire of the entire Arcavian nobility, not to mention the relations we'll build with sales like that. So now that the greedy lords can't just take our things openly, what will they do? They'll have to use other means. If they come with fair competition, we'll stomp them into the ground. And if they come in the night, they'll never return. Corco's voice became firm upon his assertion. But what's the product? Our wine is good, but not without match. There's plenty of Balat traders eager to take our place. How can we offer something no one else can do? Corco looked at the frowning Brym and tapped his temple in reply. With this. I have more than enough ideas up here to make money with. But first, we'll need to do some marketing. Otherwise we'll just repeat what happened in Balat. Marketing. Brym's always curious eyes grew large upon encountering a strange new word. We'll give the lords a little taste of our new products, for free. Something of great value, which cannot be bought with money. Soon, dukes and kings will be begging us to sell it to them, all so they can show off the exclusive wares. How does my face look? Done with his disguise, Corco raised his head and turned it to let his companions get a good look at his handiwork. Atau barely failed to suppress a chuckle, while Fidelio wordlessly came forward to fix what must have been a spotty and streaky whitening. So. For now we run. Brym asked again. No. First we need to get back to Etra. Korko patted the barrel next to him. We'll need to use the alchemist's distillery. Now we even have the money to pay him. Wait, the alchemist. Wasn't that the shop in the shady alley? Atao interrupted. Why wouldn't he just call some gangsters and rob us blind once he sees those chests? Not to worry. We will be more than enough to protect Master, Fidelio answered, still focused on applying the cream. Korko, meanwhile, shook his head, and ruined his attendant's work in the process, before he pointed to his two larger companions. No, you two stay behind. You stand out far too much, even in disguise. If the Duke has spies in Etra, and why wouldn't he, they'll run back to Ballot the second they see you. With a bit of work and a few greased hands, me and Brym can get inside undetected. As for the alchemist. You really think that man will touch our gold once we tell him it belongs to the Duke of Ballot? Don't worry, I'll make sure he doesn't get any strange ideas. And after that? Atao asked again. His voice had become deeper, no doubt depressed at the thought of their ignoble escape. We'll go sightseeing for a bit. Over the next year, we'll follow the good weather and travel through Arcavia. First though, you guys will have to learn a few things. I need to get you ready for our great performance. Under the worried looks of the remaining merchants, Korko had started to grin again. This would be fun. With small steps, Zolo moved towards the large wooden door. As one of the Duke's messengers, he was supposed to rush there, but the tightness in his heart convinced him to delay his arrival for as long as he could. He really wanted to run away. However, he knew that failure to deliver a message would have even harsher consequences than delivering bad news. Thus, he took a heart and pushed open the door. The hall he entered was dark and stuffy. All sunlight had been robbed from the room by the large bear pelts which covered the narrow windows in the grey stone walls. The only source of light within the room came from the lavish fireplace, its flames enhancing the frightful view on the bear skull hung above it. Next to the fire, a table had been set and on it, the recipient of his message was busy with his midday meal. Duke Herak. There is a message from Etra. Zolo pretended to be out of breath. After all, it would have been his duty to run all the way here. The Duke's head shot up from his grilled meat to study his servant's face. Zolo tried to do the same, with little success. It wasn't surprising, as the whole upper half of Duke Herak's face was covered by a bronze mask, which shimmered in the flickering lights of the fire. It was a reminder of his greatest shame and his greatest triumph. The accident all those years ago had horribly disfigured the Duke. It forced him to wear his mask and shun the eyes of the public, but at the same time, his actions that day had saved the life of his brother. As a result, Duke Herak had become the favorite relative of the King of Borna. Over the years, it had allowed him much freedom to do as he liked, as he did during his unlawful seizure of the fast-grade merchant company. At last, word from my men. You may speak. A grand gesture to show his magnanimity. Zolo braced himself for when the Duke would lose his composure and break his facade. Milord. It seems. Milord's men have perished. The messenger's quiet voice was followed by a heavy bang. The noble fist landed in anger and shot the Duke's plate off his table, precious meat and all. What did you say, you worm? Those were true knights. Do you dare tell me 10 Ballot knights failed to take on a handful of merchants? Gone was the calm, noble demeanor as the enraged Duke spat saliva and bits of meat into Zolo's face. The messenger made himself as small as he could and retained his quiet voice. This wasn't the first bad message he had delivered. He had long learned how to increase his chances for survival. The scouts believed that the men became the target of an ambush. They must have been outnumbered several-fold. After all, without a heinous sneak attack, no knight of Ballot would be defeated. A lie, but Arcavus would forgive him for saving his hide, and for preventing the Duke from committing the sin of murder in the process. Lords be damned. I'll have those heathens on a spike. At least for now, the enraged Duke was no longer focused on Zolo. Instead, he looked to unleash his anger on the poor merchants he had stolen from. Where are they now? Have the scouts not taken them in yet? Unfortunately. The guards on Etra's east walls swear that it has been at least 8 days since the merchants left the city with the ballot knights in tow. No one has seen them since, and the scouts are unsure where they went from there. Useless, the lot of you. A goblet flew towards Zolo, but he made no attempt to dodge. Getting wet was a cheap price to pay for his life. Take 1,000 guilders from the treasury. I want every man in Borna, no, every man in Arcavia to know that it will be theirs if they bring me the heads of the heathen merchants. I'll show those rats what it means to defy the bear of Borna. Yes, my lord. With a bow, Zolo turned on his heels and left the room, his steps much faster than on his entry. He could feel the sweat trickling down his brow. Again, he had survived. Chapter 7 Marketing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A sharp glint of light bounced off the edges of the crossed halberds and landed on Korko's face. Lords and ladies. Your Majesty. Now, for the grand attraction of the evening. Under the flamboyant voice of Bombasticus from beyond the door, Korko stared into the polished axe heads before him. However, first I will ask your Majesty to pick a card. Any from within this ordinary deck will do. It was soon time for his grand entry, so the prince decided to go over his appearance one final time. The halberd reflected back the new look he had been sporting for half a year. Whitened, clean-shaven skin and black hair to his shoulders, parted down the middle and slicked back. Please do not show the card to me or anyone else. It will serve as proof of the medium's authenticity. His wear was somewhat crooked, so Korko grabbed the hem of his shirt to reorganize a bit. The tailor-made suit was something he was especially fond of, a style of clothing from the other world. For his purpose, it was perfect. Strange enough on Arcavia to give an air of mystery, but the elegant design and expensive fabric distinguished him from the bright, patchy colors of common traveling folk. He would rather not be accused of eating children by an enraged mob, so they had spent a great deal on their appearances, to not be mistaken for entertainers. Thus, please allow me to introduce the great medium, the seer of seers, the great master Korkapeka fast grade. Without sound, the halberds before him slid to the side. Korko followed them with his gaze until he locked eyes with one of the 2 grumpy guards who had barred his way until now. A short wink towards the guard and he was off to the fruits of their labor, the high court of Enila. A great bit of smoke and noise obscured his entrance as he traveled over the raw sandstone floor of the hall. Kneeled by the door, Brym was throwing firecrackers again to make the medium's entrance more spectacular. At least this room didn't have any flammable furniture. That kind of oversight had almost cost them dearly back in Kalia. With upright posture, hands held behind his back and large, swift strides, Korko stepped through the ill-smelling clouds and soon found himself in front the collected lords and ladies of Enila, seated on comfortable-looking, deep chairs set up in a neat row. Small tables had been fastened to the chairs, to house the food and drink the great nobles would enjoy during their time of leisure. Korko found no throne, despite the room being a supposed court. Your Majesty has chosen the 5 of Kings, truly a choice befitting of a noble heir. Before anyone could say a word, Korko opened up to give his prediction. He wouldn't want to be accused of cheating again, so the prince had cut down on the theatrics when he had refined his performance over the past months. The result was exactly as desired. King Sabian's eyes turned into slits from his smile as he nodded in satisfaction. The man's white-streaked chin beard left his face uncovered and made it easy to read his emotions. Good, that could be useful later. After his approval, the king revealed the card in his hand to his surroundings. 5 kings were printed on the paper. In recent years, printing machines had been getting more and more widespread all throughout Arcavia. With the increased availability of paper and printed materials, playing cards had similarly spread across the 40.4 nations of Arcavia and become a favorite pastime of the rich and high-born. Truly, as expected from the mysterious medium of the West. We have heard great tales. Of course the king would be happy. In Arcavia, the number 5 was linked with great prosperity. Paired up with the suit of kings, it was truly a good omen. Corco still preferred the more abstract suits in his memories, like spades and diamonds, but for their purposes, the more expressive cards were even more useful. Although Bombasticus had spent a lot of time learning how to force a card onto someone without their knowledge, it had been worth it. To the man's dismay, the alchemist had a natural talent for stage tricks. He would have to bear with the humiliation. After all, that was the deal they had struck back in Etra. No need for undue praise, Your Majesty. Not until the actual reading has taken place. A snort disguised as a laugh interrupted the harmonious atmosphere. A younger noble, seated close to the king, had his arms crossed and a frown on his face. He also had an entirely different opinion from everyone else. A cheap trick, nothing more. How would the word of a charlatan have any weight within the high court? The king's frown barely registered with Corco, as did the shocked looks of the other nobles. He was already focused on the disturbance, looking for points of attack. Young and strong, with a beard similar to the king's. His posture was forward-leaning, which gave an aggressive impression. His clothing and hair were a bit unkempt, at least for a member of nobility. Corco spotted the emerald ring hung from a chain around his neck, a typical symbol of martial might around these parts, and usually worn on the finger, unless it was a memento. It would be a good start. "Milord, if this charlatan may, before I am thrown from this noble hall, I have a message to deliver to you." Corco answered before the angry king could. He would rather keep the atmosphere happy. "Ha! Try your worst, trickster. Walter of Canias will not be fooled." Corco retained his shallow smile as he made a mental note of the name. Another bit of information to be used. He had tried cold reading, the art of pretending knowledge, before. After a good bit of practice, he had gotten a basic handle on things. He was by no means an expert, but usually his appearance, assured attitude, and the wide-spread superstition of the people did most of the work anyways. "In my dream last night appeared a man. He said that to Lord Walter, he was a father figure of sorts." A sneer formed on the man's face. "That's all. As I said, parlor tricks, no more." "Who was the man, if I may ask the great medium?" "He would not tell me his name, but I could see a darkness in his torso. His chest or abdomen. It must have been the cause of his death." Upon hearing the word abdomen, Walter's sneer turned into a frown. "Abdomen it is," Corco made another mental note. "The man told me that he understood how Milord was still lost in grief over the loss, every now and then. He knew there are many things Milord would want to apologize for or clear up." The frown slowly disappeared from the man's face as his eyes widened in shock. "Bullseye, however, he wishes Milord to know that despite his actions during his lifetime, there has only ever been love in his heart. He asks Lord Walter to move on with life and live without regrets." "Uncle," the noble whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, as tears welled up in his eyes. "Too easy." The shocked lords and ladies within the hall broke out in applause as Corco bowed to conclude his trick. The king himself seemed especially impressed. Truly magnificent. A true seer, as told in the stories. Corco retained his shameless smile. Of course there would be stories. He had paid good money for the bards to spread them throughout the continent. "I hope your majesty has heard nothing shameful." "Of course not. Who would dare speak poorly of a great man like yourself? Though there was one tale in particular which grabbed our interest." The king picked up his wine goblet and swirled it in his hand while he looked down into the golden liquid within. Corco's smile grew wider, only by a fraction. This was what he had been hoping for. And which one would that be, your majesty? He asked in anticipation. There has been tale of a heavenly drink, a wine of the gods. He looked back up from his wine and towards Corco, who still stood there with perfect posture, unfazed before all the great personages of the country. The tricks and lies had been the easiest part of their performances. The stage fright had almost killed him though. Luckily, after 6 months and 15 different courts, he had finally begun to get a handle on his nerves. It had only been barons or counts so far, but now he could steady his mind even before a king. Indeed, my lord, it is the truth. It happened almost a year ago, on the night of the winter solstice. I looked into my wine and what did I see there? Corco began to spin his story. My master Garrett was within, and he spoke to me. How could this be? Master had already died. Frightened I was, a mere commoner, face to face with a man from beyond the grave. It would be my first vision of many. Corco thought back to the time Count Barnow's troops, disguised as merchants, had passed them off after their performance the city. Atau really shouldn't have slept with the guy's daughter, but his reaction was still excessive, as far as Corco was concerned. The ensuing battle and escape was the closest they had come to death on their travels. It had left a deep scar on Corco's courage, as well as his left shoulder blade. Luckily, the crossbow bolt had been nothing more than a brush with fate. If fate had pierced him instead, he would have had one hand less to do card tricks with. As always, the prince evoked the right memory for the occasion. It made it easy for him to elicit a feeling of dread on his face, perfect for the scene. However, Master had not come out of malice, but out of kindness instead, like so often in his time. He had come to regale to the unworthy commoner tales from the beyond. Of life among the stars, life under the 5 great suns of Arcavis. And he told of a heavenly drink, a grape of the finest sort, watered with fresh moon dew and grown on a mound of gold, only fit for the noblest of men to enjoy. Corco thought back to the wonder he had felt the first time he had seen, and smelled, the endless fields of lavender around his mother's home of Sonia, and he thought back to the eternal glimmer of the stars from the top of the holy Mount Urkina. Within the infinite universe, his own trivial nature alone was enough to make him feel reverential awe, but the thought still helped him adjust his mood. And Master told me as well that he had been sent by the lords. Sent to spread the message across the gap, into the realm of living men, so all children of Arcavis could partake in their heavenly splendor. Suddenly, I could smell a fragrance far beyond the mortal world within my hands. I looked down and found that my wine had turned into the wine of the gods, a true miracle. It was a drink beyond what man should know to achieve. My master's ghost told of instructions, methods to produce the drink, a kind gift from the lords to their heirs. When I first followed the steps, I produced a drink far beyond any wine I had tasted before. Even still I wept, for I knew that what I had drunk on the night of the solstice was far beyond any taste I could achieve in a lifetime. Still, I would devote my very being to the trade of brewery, determined to improve the noble craft, reach as close as I could to the vision my master imbued in me that day. Only then would I go and spread the splendor of Arcavis across the lands of the earth. Corco did his best to retain a pious look on his face. He didn't really like archivism too much. Not their fanatical practices nor their penchant for deifying their dead rulers. Still, he had to pretend. Archivism was quite literally the religion of the nobility in these parts. The same nobles would also be his main clientele going forward. If he had to blaspheme some gods to make his product more appealing, at least he could do it to the fake gods of Arcavia. As I travel the lands, in search for the perfect ingredients, I keep improving my results, while I use my miraculous connection with the beyond to support the honorable lords of Arcavia in their duties as best as I can. Truly a miracle, the smiling king nodded. We are quite curious. How far has Master Fastgrade gone in his attempts? How close to the final product would Master be by now? Corco lowered his head, as he pretended a shy smile. Indeed, just this week I have managed to complete one batch to minimal satisfaction. Though it is imperfect, still far from the miracle of the gods it can be deemed enough to proudly present to their heirs. It is the only reason I would dare stand before your majesty today. So it is done. The king leaned forward in his seat, the goblet still in his hand. Who else would be more suitable to judge the quality of the Lord's wine than the great King Sabian IV? Outstanding. The king's goblet slammed onto the chair's armrest and sprayed its golden contents over the bread and meat on the attached table. Quick, bring it forth, this drink of the Lord's. We will see if it truly lives up to its reputation. At once, your majesty. Brym. Korko turned to look at his ward, who had parked himself in the back of the room since he had livened up Korko's entrance. In his hands he clutched a large travel bag, filled with all kinds of props for their magic acts and, most importantly, with their first batch of brandy. Yes, master. The boy answered with the energy only youth could bring. Bring the brandy, Korko smiled. 6-month storage, with a mellowed bouquet. It was the reason they had finally dared to step before a king. He would be their first free advertising board, with many more to follow. Finally, after 6 months of work, their marketing would pay off. Soon, it would be harvest season. Chapter 8 Second Product. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This is an outrage, the alchemist screamed through the sun-filled walkways of the outer castle. As he walked by the man's side, Korko looked past him, down onto the port city. The tall houses of the merchants, red roofs vibrant in the sunshine, spoke of the port city's prosperity. Truly one of the nicer places on Arcavia, at least from a distance. In another world, it might have been considered a must-see tourist attraction. Outrage. Hieronymus raised his voice even higher, which slumped Korko's shoulder. Even Brym, who had run up ahead, turned around and watched in curiosity, the bag of props still clutched in his arms. It seemed like ignoring the alchemist wouldn't be an option, so the prince looked towards the quack chemist with the long beard. Before he could answer though, Brym had already done it for him. What is an outrage, Master Bombasticus? I will tell you, boy. I am the great Hieronymus Bombasticus, not a jokester who would perform tricks in front of others. Again. Once again the alchemist complained about his role in their stage acts. They had the same discussion every other city they came through. Still, it was a routine the alchemist insisted on. As always, Korko would play along, just to placate the man. Look, you remember the deal we made in Etra, right? An uncomfortable look was on his face as his head turned to the side to look out into the sunshine. They left the outer walkway of Anila Castle and made their path through the outer gardens. Rather than a garden, it was a random assortment of wild grass, flowers and trees. Another sign of the unsophisticated nature of the Arcavians, Korko thought. Okay, my turn then, the prince answered for the silent alchemist. You were willing to give us access to your equipment. We used your still, but you really shouldn't have stuck around to make sure we don't steal anything. Which we could have done either way, what with 3 knight-strength men on our side and the one skinny alchemist on yours. Now it's too late for regrets. Now you know the way to make the brandy, at least somewhat, and we can't just let you go. A snort from his left interrupted Korko. Just a simple drink, nothing more. A bit of distillation is all it takes. Why would that be a secret worth keeping? You're still saying that? Today of all days. You saw how the king reacted to that very drink. He went crazy over it. Just how much do you think the nobles of Arcavia are willing to spend on a wine made with instructions from the lords themselves? Visibly uncomfortable, the alchemist began to drag his feet. He should understand very well how much money there would be in the exclusive rights to such a product. Meanwhile, Brym's eyes sparkled with an "oh" at the thought of their revitalizing business empire. So really, what choice did you leave us? Korko continued, the options were to kill you or take you along. We chose the latter, since we're such nice people. Now you're part of our gang of outlaws, as far as Duke Herak is concerned. Means you're no longer a threat to our business, since your safest place is right here. The alchemist opened his mouth, but Corco raised his voice first. And please don't tell me I would prefer death over humiliation. No clichés, thank you. Bombasticus closed his mouth, and for a while the three walked in silence, further away from the center of power behind them. Only when they had passed the outer wall and fully left the castle did the alchemist pick up the thread of conversation. Still, there is no need to include me in these embarrassing plays. Acts. It's stage magic. Well, mentalism, really. Whatever it is, Sire could just as well have some of his friends assist him. One brow raised, Corco returned a bemused look. Have the giants play magician? No thank you. That sounds like a terrible idea for everyone involved. Not like we didn't try anyways. Fidelio can play the role, but he lacks the finger speed for the kind of stuff you do. As for Atao. Yes, better not have your cousin take part in any more performances, big brother. Brym finished the sentence with a shudder. Plus, you've got talent for this stuff. You're good at it. Got the whole flamboyance part down pat, and your alchemic knowledge gives you all the tricks you need to bamboozle your way to the top. Finally, their goal had come into view. A shabby old stable, put outside the castle for the ox carts. The accommodations the royals of Anila had blessed them with. Just look at this treatment. How unsuited for a great alchemist. I might be forced to play along, but there is no reason for me to enjoy it. Of course not, Corco smiled. He understood very well how much fun Hieronymus had during their travels, but especially so during their performances. It's only a few more times now. After today, we'll camp out here for a few nights and wait for our names to spread out with the traders and bards. From then on, it's only kings and queens for us. Another 8 or so countries and we're back to Borna. Then you'll be free of your magic duties. The door to the stable was opened with a creak. The first thing Corco noticed through the stench of the inside was the strange visitor they had received, hidden within the straw on the ground. Who's this? Corco asked towards the back of the room in a stern voice. With great curiosity, he studied the man who lay on the floor before him, tied up and gagged. They really shouldn't just let prisoners stick around all by themselves. Ah, lackeys. Welcome back. Atao came from the back room while wiping his hands with a silk cloth, his beard neatly trimmed as always. How'd the performance go? Who's this? Corco ignored the question. The bound stranger seemed more important for now. Just another one of Herak's people. That's the third this month. Atao kicked the prisoner's foot. In reaction, a few muffled sounds escaped from his mouth as he squirmed around. He's not gonna let up, is he? Corco concluded. Maybe it's high time for the Duke to learn that he can't just send normal people to deal with a group of cultivators. He better not learn anything, Brym said with a shudder. Therein lies a further problem. Even when I agreed to come along, I could never fathom that the Duke would hate your group this much. I mean, assassins. When would a great alchemist have to deal with this sort of violence? Until now, Hieronymus had stayed silent, but finally he broke and promptly began to complain again. Look friend, we know that you have your own trouble with the Borna nobles. No need to push the attacks only onto us, Atao complained right back. How? The alchemist's whisper was accompanied by his widening eyes. The great alchemist talks in his sleep. A grin forced its way onto Atao's face, and Corco was soon infected. Isn't that how it is, O great alchemist Ronald Bakeling? Ronald's face first turned white and then red, his great secret revealed. How could a great alchemist have such a mundane name? Meanwhile, Atao's laugh rang throughout the stable, while Corco and Brym doubled over and held their stomachs, a futile attempt to suppress their own fits and not insult their companion any further. The donkeys in the background, meanwhile, were completely unfazed by the noise. At least in this area, donkeys were much better than horses, was what Korko thought. That's enough. I will see if the large one doesn't botch the alchemic work again. And thus, the great alchemist, embarrassed by their laughter, marched off into the back of the stable, where the escaping vapor told of Fidelio's work for the day. Ah, I wanna see too. Curious as ever, Brym ran after the sulking Ronald. Once his body had recovered from the quivering fits of laughter, Korko released the tension in his body with a satisfied sigh. In contrast, Atau had begun to frown as he looked down on the over-enthusiastic would-be headhunter. Still, are you sure we should go back to Etra? You know Herak is no idiot. The only reason we haven't seen anyone with ability go after us is because we've been moving away from Borna all this time, away from the danger. The half-year is up now and we've reached all the way to the north-east coast. It's time to move back across the continent, which leads us right into Herak's arms. A nod from Korko confirmed Atau's assessment. You're not wrong. It seems needlessly dangerous, going back to Etra and setting up shop there. Still, it has to be done, just like this. The closer we are to Herak, the more he believes he has control and the more likely he is to make a mistake. Korko marched over to their own wagon, beyond the donkeys, with his cousin in tow. And we can't just take him out. Korko looked back towards the distant prisoner. From this far away, he wouldn't hear anything anymore. Commoners killing a lord. You want to get the church on our asses. No, we have to be more subtle and let the lords solve it among themselves. Look at this. Korko pulled out a little leather sack from one of his pockets, weighed down by the metal inside. All gold coins. That's not payment though. It's a gift. The overjoyed King Sabian handed it over, in gratitude. You asked earlier how today's act went. They were going crazy over the brandy, especially the men. Korko went to the back of their boxy wagon, where he unlocked the secret mechanism and slid open the trick door. Within he found the short barrels in which their brandy was being matured and, wedged in the gaps, the leftover gold from the old fast-grade stash. For the first time since the start of their journey, it was time to add to it, rather than take away. That's great news. We were running low, you know. You've been spending far too much. You gotta spend money to make money. Give it another month and everyone in Arcavia will know our names. Then what do you think will happen if Duke Herak dares to attack a messenger of the lords, the only one to provide the heavenly drink? The secret stash closed off again, the cousins walked towards the back of the room as well, towards the vapor. Well, I have to say. Even if your plan wasn't any better than killing the Duke outright, at least it's a whole lot funnier. Atau grinned as he opened the door to the back, a little annex they had slept in last night and would continue to sleep in over the next few days. When Korko stepped into the room, a wave of warm air made his head turn to the side. He could feel the humidity on his exposed hands and face. Clearly, the warriors had been hard at work as well. Boss, Ronnie says it went well. Fidelio's hopeful voice reached Korko, who opened his eyes and looked towards the warrior, sitting on the floor and hunched over a bubbling pot. Meanwhile, Ronnie sat on the far wall, too engrossed in his sulking to even react to the name. Any luck today? We'll know soon. The last batch is evaporating right now. I still got no idea how this is gonna help us though. So far we've had no success. Still staring into the pot, Fidelio answered. Korko followed his example and found that most of the water had disappeared by now. It wouldn't even be a minute more until they had the results. What do you mean you have no idea? It's just more leaching, right? Nothing new, Brym asked. Yeah, but leaching vegetables. We're not exactly gonna get a weapon out of this, are we? Atau chimed in as he took a seat in the corner, one long leg stretched over the ground. We're not looking for a weapon. Well, in a way we are, I guess. It's the most potent weapon of them all, really. Korko's face widened into a grin as he saw the last of the water disappear and leave behind a light brown film on the bottom of the pot. This might just be it, and in such quantity too. Every place they had stopped, they had tried leaching every single root vegetable they could find. Without question, without fault. All in search for the precious contents before them right now. Fidelio took a wooden spoon from the side, something meant for stirring rather than eating, but it fit the oversized warrior's hand perfectly. He dipped the spoon into the still liquid mass and brought it to his face. Under the tense gazes of the men around him, Fidelio blew on the mass a few times before he tried the results, without fear. Immediately, his eyes opened wide in surprise. The spoon left his mouth again with a plop. "It's sweet," he said as he stared up at Korko's wide grin. "Guys, meet our second main product. Sugar. From the amount we've produced, these roots aren't anywhere near as good as sugar beets, but it'll do just fine. Soon, we'll need more than just a wagon to fit our gold." Chapter 9 Cultivation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With a short sigh, Korko paused in his writing for a moment and put down the feather quill. Even though his memory had always been exceptional, in either life, he had spent every free minute writing down the precious knowledge in his head. Just to make sure. Since no one else would be able to read the otherworld's language, there was no threat of leaks, so he didn't have to censor himself and could write to his heart's content. Still, it wasn't exactly fun, neither for him nor for his wrist. As a result, he tried to loosen the stiffness with a few turns of his hand. The constant work had really worn on him, but it was work which had to be done. The precious knowledge would be the basis to everything, the basis of their counterattack, not only against the Duke of Ballet, but against the world itself. As a distraction from the discomfort in his cramped fingers, he looked around himself to observe the simple, clean room. With satisfaction, he had seen the quality of their temporary shelters jump up ever since they had left Enila. They had moved back west again, over the entire length of the continent. With every station they passed, every royal court they had entered, his weight as great seer and messenger of the lords had grown, until they were allowed to stay in the castle proper, in rooms which would otherwise be reserved for real nobility. However, their current location was, in fact, far removed from the castle, which was also reflected in the open nature of Korko's surroundings. Quite unlike the usual style of the Arcavians, the large, mostly empty room opened up towards a clean, simple garden, which sported a small pond as its centerpiece. Proof of the cosmopolitan nature of Whiteport, the latest station of their journey. No surprise, as the city was positioned on the very western edge of Arcavia. Just over the Sea of Faith, they would enter into Shamoa, enemy lands occupied by the heathens. The simple, open gardens were a remnant from the time the Shamoa people had occupied the eastern coast of Arcavia. Even though the invaders had been gone for centuries, in their years of occupation they had left behind much of their culture. Within the simple yard, right before the pond and among the neatly trimmed grass, sat his chubby ward, sunk into deep concentration. A sudden movement from Brym made Korko's shoulders jerk up in reflex, guilty that he had been slacking off even as the boy had been hard at work. The young merchant jumped up and turned. With short, quick steps, he rushed over to Korko, excitement written in his features as much as in his breaking voice. Big bro, big bro. I felt it. It's true. Korko first raised one brow in confusion, and then the second as he understood what Brym's words really meant. You felt the world's flow. Just short of Korko's seat, Brym broke his rush with his hands stemmed against the large table with the scattered efforts of the prince's work. Out of breath, the boy nodded his head like a pecking chicken. I do. I just felt the waves everyone's been talking about. Never had I thought I could learn cultivation, not with my heritage. Yeah, it's a nice surprise. You were pretty fast as well, most people need a year of training. You stayed just under. While the boy began to blush and rub his head from embarrassment, Korko sank into thought. Cultivation was one of the few things he truly didn't understand in this world. As far as he knew, the meditative art had not existed in his other life, not in this form. Only in fantasy stories would people possess strange powers like the ones which had felt so natural to Korko all his life. It was a strange discrepancy, and not something which fit into his new rational worldview. Still, enough experimentation should help him figure out the mechanics behind the miracle. Brym's cultivation training was a nice start, one which proved that those without noble bloodline could learn the mysterious techniques as well as anyone. For the societies of this world, the implication of wide-spread cultivation would be huge. Big bro. Brym raised his voice at Korko, who had drifted off far into the future. In recent months, this had happened a lot. Now that his knowledge had been expanded to such a degree, there were far too many things he had to consider. What did you say? I just asked. If maybe it was a bad idea to teach me these things. It's your family's secret, isn't it? With his nervous look pointed at the floor, Brym mumbled his question again. This time, Korko reacted with a smile rather than with silence. First of all, it's not that secret. The world's flow is a technique meant for normal warriors of the Pluritak clan, not the imperial family. Many people have been taught these techniques for lesser reason. Not to mention, we are family, so teaching you a family technique should be fine. You're not gonna deny that, are you? His nervousness blown away, Brym shook his head with a happy grin which made his hair violently flow around his ears. So what happens now? Do I keep going? If I keep going, will I get as tall as Fidelio? Will I grow a beard like Atao? Will I be able to shoot fire like in the stories? His hands raised, Korko tried to contain Brym's enthusiasm. Wait. 1 second. Also, one question at a time. It's important you don't overdo it with both seconds and questions. And breathing. Should remember that one as well. First of all. For today, we'll pack things in. Getting into the right mindset again will take you a lot of meditation. And it's getting late. With a look out onto the garden, reddening in the evening sun, the prince decided to pack things up. Second, he continued, you're not gonna get much taller. Just look at me. You're plenty tall though, big bro, the merchant's son said. His eyes followed up Korko's head as he rose on his feet, far above the stubby merchant kid. For a commoner maybe, but not for a noble. For a noble, I'm tiny. By the way, there's a good reason why the nobles in every country values height this much. For fuck's sake, they've pretty much selectively bred themselves. Korko bent over the table to collect the loose papers, densely scribbled with his handwriting. They would be bound and then stored in their carts for safekeeping, together with the wine and the money. As he went through his daily cleanup, he continued his explanation. Cultivation won't make you taller, as far as I can tell. It also won't let you shoot fireballs. Those stories are just that. Stories. Made up. Miracles like that make for good creation myths after all, and the Arcavians needed a damn good one to suppress the Pasha faith. Even before he had been banned from entering their academy, Korko had always been bothered by the Arcavian religion. Now, with his new perspective, he understood even more the arrogance of declaring your dead kings gods. No one had any right to feel special just because they had killed a lot of people or conquered a lot of land. Even if the Arcavis fanatics hadn't driven Korko's ancestors out of the continent and across the ocean, he still wouldn't have liked them any more than he did. So if it won't let me do any of that, what does the cultivation do then? Brym, more interested in his training rather than another one of Korko's rants, tried his best to redirect the conversation. In the meantime, the two had exited the grand building and gone out into the ill-smelling streets of Whiteport. For now, my best guess is that this cultivation stuff is some sort of pinpointed gene manipulation. I'm not sure though. The results of each technique can vary, but you'll only ever get improved human capability. More efficient muscles, faster cell regeneration, slower aging process. That's also why the nobles hope for tall children. If you start with a gap in strength before you cultivate for better muscles, a small difference will turn into an insurmountable one. Even though both me and Fidelio are cultivators, even though I'm training in the methods reserved for only the imperial princes, I'm nowhere near as strong as him. As Corco made his explanation, they were well on their way back to the castle. The castle itself was built for protection, so the kings and queens of Whiteport would be able to sleep at night. With the enemy just a single boat trip away, they were always fearful to have their riches taken by a Sherman invasion from across the sea. Since the castle had been designed to avoid weak points, the entire palace lacked any water features beyond cisterns. Since his family's techniques required nearby water as a focus, they had to move out of the castle and into the city for Brym's training. Luckily, the king was more than willing to provide a suitable room in the inner city. After Corco had predicted a prosperous future for him and his family, a little favor like that weighed very light. Still, getting stronger would be nice, and learning to fight. While Brym was still fantasizing about his future, the castle walls had come into view. Through the blinding sun, Corco could spot Fidelio's huge silhouette waiting for them by the entrance. Once again, the warrior had spent most of his free time scouring the various markets to look for any of the countless plants, seeds and animal breeds Corco had described in his writing and, somewhat insufficiently, attempted to sketch. By now, they had built an impressive collection of useful agrarian products, ready to be used in his future empire. "Sire, are you the great seer, Corcopeka fast grade?" Out of nowhere, a man spoke to them from the left. Corco looked over and saw tall shoulders with long, dirty brown hair, which covered most of the man's face. He frowned at the stranger's sudden entry, but wasn't surprised. In the end, the unknown man was well dressed and had spoken with a calm and polite attitude. Since their reputation had grown, there were many lords who wanted to partake in his exclusive services. Many would address him in disguise or under any number of excuses, for fear that the local ruler would begrudge them stealing the one they considered the royal medium. Still, something about the man seemed off. "Yes indeed, sire. He stands before you. What can we?" While Brym was still talking, the man began to speed up. With swift steps he rushed ahead, over to Brym. His body turned to the side and his right hand hung behind his back. "Trouble, Brym, back!" Corco shouted. He knew what would come next. The prince pushed his feet off the dirty cobble and ran forward, ready to protect his dead master's son. In panic, all he could do was shove his ward to the side before he felt a stinging pain in his side. With large eyes, Corco looked up to the man who had just stabbed the dagger into his flank. Too fast, too accurate, no doubt about it, this one was a cultivator, and a good one. The man's dark eyes stared into his, a grim glimmer hidden within. "Duke Hurek sends his regards," the man said, ready to pull away and disappear into the crowd. Within a split second, Corco's head turned from panic to anger. The man had waited to pass him off here. He had used his protection of Brym to create an opening, and now he would disappear after such a ridiculous villain line. Not if he had a word in this, only over his dead body. As his body remembered exercises it had never performed in this life, his hands grabbed the man's wrist, the one he had plunged the dagger with. With all his strength, the prince kept the attacker from running. Surprised by the resistance, the fleeing assassin was pulled back. A short twist of his arms and Corco saw the stranger drop onto the ground. Soon, the prince had dropped his knees on the attacker's back to restrain him. Angry, the warrior began to stem himself into the dirt to throw off his mark, with a force far beyond human. Corco could feel his hand lose his grip bit by bit as he was bucked around and the pain in his side turned from stinging to searing. The attacker was much stronger than the prince himself, which could only mean one thing. He must have been a true knight, one of Herak's confidants. This wasn't a fight Corco could win, not with the knife still plunged in his body. Luckily, he didn't have to. As the knight was about to fight off Korko's suppression, he saw an axe plunge itself deeply into the assassin's skull. Exhausted, Korko dropped onto his back. He looked up to see the face of his attendant, as white as freshly fallen snow. Over the beating pulse in his ears, he couldn't even hear Fidelio's panicked screams. The prince looked down onto his side and found the body of water he had been seeking inside the castle. It oozed out of his opened wound, faster and faster. Well, this doesn't look great, was Korko's last thought before he lost consciousness. Chapter 10 Fake Seer, Fake Physician. You are listening at novelfull.audio. We need to begin treatment soon. Please, could the men present offer a prayer to the lords? As if under water, a muffled sound reached Korko's ears. Weary and heavy, his eyelids opened to find unfocused silhouettes of several men towering over him. Doctor, is it bad? He heard Brym's voice, worried. There is hope yet, but we will have to act fast, an unfamiliar voice said as the silhouettes began to leave his sight. With some effort, Korko managed to open his eyes and sharpen the image around himself. As he lay on his back, he only saw a dirty wooden ceiling above. There were no sounds of murmurs coming from the outside, so they couldn't be in the city. This room should be the inside the castle proper. Doctor, he is awake. This time, it was Fidelio's voice to call out. Soon, the entire gang bent over the uncomfortable bed he was laying on, crowding his line of sight. Brym, Fidelio, Atau and Ronnie. Lockies, everything fine. How do you feel? Don't worry, the doctor has been sent to save you. Big bro. Under the bombardment of voices, Korko tried his best to push himself up into a sitting position. Suddenly, a biting pain stung his left and pearls of sweat formed on his face. His heavy groan caused Fidelio to step in and hold down the injured prince. Careful, boss. With his warrior's help, the crown prince managed to sit up. Finally, he could get a better look at the surroundings. Dark, dirty and cramped, the room's interior design was the preferred style of Albius, king of Whiteport. However, something was off about the room. From his left, Korko felt a heat, emanating from a warm illumination, so unusual for the grim halls of Lord Spire. Hey, you're gonna say something. What's wrong? You can't talk. While the words of his companions became increasingly panicked, Korko narrowed his eyes in annoyance. Can you move over? With a scratchy voice, he spoke up and pushed Atau to the left. The move freed his sight onto the source of the heat. A middle-aged man in black robes stood over a bucket of glowing coals, his short, trimmed beard lighted up by the glow. The iron poker his clean hands held into the heat gave Korko a bad premonition. Even worse. He had seen the man before, when he had performed at the royal court 2 days ago. At the time, the men and women of the gallery had shown the greatest respect for the bearded man. After all, he was the famous court physician Frigen, of great repute along the western coast and confidant to King Albius. At the time, the doctor had seemed less than impressed by his mentalist act. Oh, great Seer Korko. You are awake. What a shame. Their eyes met across the room and Korko could see the mocking twinkle within them. I wonder, just how could the strange attacker surprise the great seer, the man who can speak to the lords and read the future? It was me who failed, big bro. He stepped in front to protect me. With a step between Frigen and his brother, Brym called in a loud voice. Please, great doctor, you have to save him. As I said, it is a shame that the patient is awake now. I really would have loved to do my work without anesthetics, but it seems like this won't do anymore. Hold him still and make sure he won't lose too much blood. I will return with the dwale as soon as possible. With a satisfied smile, the doctor rammed the metal poker into the coals before he turned and left the room. Bit by bit, it dawned on Korko just what fate lay ahead of him. It seemed like the good doctor had a problem and wasn't intent on treating him like a normal patient. Although even if the doctor were to return with best intentions, the crown prince would still be treated with medieval methods. From his memories, Korko knew just what dwale was. The vile concoction he was about to receive included hemlock, along with various other nasty substances. He really didn't want to drink poison testicle juice and then have his wound sealed by a branding iron. Crap. Beads of sweat formed on the prince's brow, though he didn't know if it came from the pain or the fear. Lock the door. Korko shouted, to the confused looks of his companions. Quick. Only with his second, more urgent call did Fidelio move over to close the bolt and lock the door. He needed time to think. Big bro, what are you doing? The doctor will soon come back to heal you, Brym said. Fuck the quack, came back the succinct response. But he is the best doctor in the country. The king's personal physician, specially sent to help the great seer. I don't need his help. Bro. Brym's voice became quiet, almost disappearing, as tears formed in his eyes. How about you first look at the damage before you talk big? Atao butted in behind his left. As if remote-controlled, Korko's view went down to his side in a mechanical motion. The bed he lay in had been dyed red in his own blood. The precious liquid had soaked the cloth and was now dripping down to form a puddle on the dark brown floorboards. Crap again. Now what? After his brain had become aware of the wound, the pain in his side returned with a vengeance. In search for an answer to his dilemma, one which wouldn't involve insulting the king by refusing his help, Korko's mind began to churn. They had prepared for this sort of emergency, but for the first time they had to deal with interference from a self-pronounced professional. In his first step, the prince pressed his hand onto his wound to stop the bleeding. Then he asked the questions he needed answers to if he wanted to avoid the iron. Do we have the travel bag with us right now? Right here. Ronnie said as he held up the large bag they carried all their stage equipment in. Good. Perfect. Take out the brandy, ethanol, catgut, needle. And the cloth. Do we have water? Even though he should have known what Korko's words meant, the alchemist only looked back in confusion. Are we not waiting for the doc? Right here. Atao shouted over the alchemist as he brought a clay pot of water to Korko's lips. Annoyed, the prince pushed his cousin's hand away. Not for me, man. Put the pot over the coals and boil some cloth for the bandages. We've done this before, right? Why is everyone just standing around? In fact, they had suffered their fair share of wounds in their early days on the road. They had applied the procedure Korko had learned from his memories and it had always been effective. Still, the men around him showed little confidence. But, Dr. Freegen should know better than us, shouldn't he? Bro, the doctor is a real physician and you're bleeding an awful lot. As Brym and Ronnie were coming up with reasons to push away responsibility, Korko narrowed his eyes in anger. He had thought they would believe in the advanced knowledge by now. You're gonna trust that quack rather than me, after all we've learned and seen over the past year. What, you want that so-called doctor to feed me donkey piss to cure my asthma? The guy hates me anyways. Even if he shows up again before I bleed out, I'm not gonna survive today if you let him work. How did you miss that? At the foot of the bed, Brym thought for a second, before his face became pale. The kid was good at putting together clues and reading people, as long as he calmed down and tried. Maybe it was because of his age, but the young merchant was still far too trusting. Once he had been made aware, he soon noticed the malice hidden within the doctor's words and actions. So what, then? As the kid was still thinking about his negligence, Atao asked the more important questions. Same as always. Clean, disinfect, suture, bandage. And give me the brandy. This shit's gonna hurt like hell. Hurt a lot, I mean. While Korko gave out instructions, Ronnie had already moved up to the left side of the bed and placed the travel bag on the ground. To dull the pain, he handed the prince a bottle of the precious drink of lords. While Korko unsealed the bottle with his teeth and took a small mouthful of the strong liquor, the alchemist began to pour medical alcohol over the needle-threaded catgut for disinfection. Meanwhile, Atao had put the water and some bandages over the bucket of coals. As everyone became immersed in their tasks, a sudden knock on the door made their heads jerk up. Apparently, Frigen had returned with the dwale, faster than the prince had thought. To make sure no one would enter without permission, Fidelio promptly pushed his back against the door. "Open up, there is no time to lose." After a few more futile attempts with the door handle, the doctor's muffled voice rang from the outside. Considering the long time it had taken him to bring over a simple medicine, he hadn't seemed in a hurry before, but his angry voice made him appear much more caring. "Impossible. Doctor, I have been tasked to never let this door open, for anyone." Fidelio answered in a calm voice. "The king wills it so. Seer Fastgrade cannot be left to perish, not on the king's lands." A frown formed on the warrior's face as he tried to come up with an excuse. Not an easy task, as the reason for his insistence would have to trump the king's command. Meanwhile, the knocks had intensified and turned into a pounding. "Let him in and hold him back. Don't let the quack near me," Korko commanded with a grin, soon turned into grimace as Ronnie worked the ethanol onto Korko's wound with a drenched piece of cloth. Soon, the doctor was rewarded for his persistent efforts as the bolt was lifted. The man fell into the room with the door he had been abusing. Another loud bang and the door closed again, before the steel rod bolted it shut once more. The doctor was first preoccupied by the doll. His fall had spilled all over his expensive black robes, but soon he looked up and saw the activity within the room. "What in all the heavens is going on here?" he asked towards the gang, busy in their various medical exercises. "Just sit and watch," Fidelio's threatening voice came from above the doctor, who looked back to the towering warrior and scrambled away to an unoccupied corner. With large eyes, he looked on as the alchemist used equipment meant for housewives to sew shut the nasty wound. Korko, meanwhile, had another piece of cloth in his mouth, to make sure he wouldn't ruin his teeth or bite his tongue during the operation. At least the doctor's panicked look gave him a modicum of comfort as the rough cloth suppressed his groans of pain. "What are you doing? You will murder this man. Do you understand what will happen to me if the seer dies?" Frigen tried to stand up, to stop the man who stuck the needle into the bloody flesh of his victim, but a heavy hand landed on his shoulder to press him down onto his knees with the weight of an anvil. "On your way here, it seems like the king told you to do your work properly," Fidelio said from behind him as his hand increased in pressure, "but there's no need to be alarmed. Just sit back and watch as we do our thing. Worst case, you can always tell the truth and then none of this will be your fault." The warrior's words soon shut up the quack, who calmed down further the more he thought his position through. "Best he dies now. That way I won't have to make my hands dirty," was what Korko imagined the man would be thinking. He knew that the worst of the pain had passed after the disinfection, especially now that the brandy had kicked in. Thus, the prince removed the cloth from his mouth and presented the quack with his bargain. "I won't die," he opened with a smile, "no organs were damaged. The blade got caught on the ribs, but didn't do damage to the bone, at least none Ronnie here could see." "True, but you should hold still unless you wish to see that change," Dr. Bombasticus said, still fully focused on his stitching work. After another prick of the needle had caused him to suck in the air through his teeth, Korko began to complain. "How big can that wound possibly be? It is the result of your fight with a knife stuck in your side, oh great seer. Just hold still and take it like a man. I will soon have you fixed up, right as rain. Brym, can you get the kitchen to bring me some red meat? It's best if it's a bit bloody." Korko instructed the boy who had been glued to the foot of the bed with a worried look. Though he wasn't sure if it would help with his blood loss, it was better to get Brym out of the way for now and occupy his mind. That way, he wouldn't blame himself so much for the attack. "Count on me. With the chance to become useful, the kid jumped up and passed the downed Quack and Fidelio the gatekeeper, before he disappeared through the door. Okay, fake doctor, I have a deal for you, so listen up well. Who's a fake, you charlatan? How dare you compare a great physician to the likes of, the doctor called out in anger before another heavy-handed shoulder pat shut the man up. Corco had no patience for self-important quacks anyways, even more so now that he had partaken in his anesthetic. Look dude, I know exactly what you were trying to do with that hemlock you've spilled all over your robes. Even if the king threatened you into doing your best, with your methods, how big would my chances for survival be? I bet you have an idea just how real your healing powers are, you've done this long enough. Face it, you're as much of a fake as I am. It's only a matter of time until the paranoid king realizes that you're not all that great after all, and then it's off with your head. Done. While the face of the fake doctor paled from Corco's implication, Ronnie's voice interrupted the talk from the crown prince's side. How do the bandages look? Corco looked over to Atao who was still leaned over the coals and the bubbling pot of water. A bit more. Shouldn't be long though. With a nod, the fake seer looked back over to the fake doctor. As you can see, I'm not gonna die from this. Considering my constitution, I'll be able to walk within a few days. With the way it's been treated, the wound will leave behind almost no scars either. That's a miracle if I've ever seen one. Amused, Corco stared down to the kneeling doctor's dumbfounded face. So how would you like to be the creator of that miracle? Ha! The dumbfounded man answered with all his cunning. It's simple. We have something you want. A chance to prove your supreme healing skills. Meanwhile, you also have something we want. You're a close confidant to the king and we'll need your word if we want to achieve our goals. Corco put on his best harmless smile as he continued. The man who was out to kill me was sent by Herak of Balat, the Bornish duke. The attacker should be one of his knights, or someone else close to him. Has that been cleared up yet? Yeah boss, we found an insignia on his body, Fidelio answered for the confused Quack. Of course Corco couldn't know if the man had really been dumb enough to carry the duke's heraldry or if the tall warrior had slipped the corpse one of their fakes, but it really didn't matter right now. Okay, so here's what I want you to tell the king. You, the great Dr. Frighten. Free Gen. Okay, whatever. You, the great doctor, have used all of your skill to save the life of the seer, but during your operation the medium began to speak in a strange voice. The voice warned of a great threat to the streets of Whiteport, a calamity caused by one who has lost his path and turned away from the lords. Duke Balat has turned to the old idols, and the heathen needs to be stopped to guarantee Whiteport's continued prosperity. As you heard the voice, your fingers began to move by themselves, working better than they ever had. Thus, the miracle of my cure was born. The doctor's eyes became larger and larger as Corco continued. In the end, his head shook again and again as he whispered, blasphemy, unwilling to believe what he had heard. Whether it's blasphemy or not doesn't matter, really. Just tell me who you want to be. The fake doctor who tried to kill the king's newest toy, or the miracle worker who saved the greatest seer of Arcavia. With a smile, Corco watched as the man's face of horror was slowly replaced by one of deep contemplation. Though he had to pretend a struggle to preserve his reputation, the prince knew that Free Gen had made his decision already. Finally, Duke Herak would get to taste some of his own medicine.